sweltering summer of 1716, 14 of South Carolina's richest planters rode up the Live Oak Drive at La Sombra, laughing, drinking, confident. 3 days later, ash fell like black snow across the marsh. Their bodies were found in a perfect circle around a roaring coal furnace, wrists locked in iron, mouths stuffed with cotton as if the fields had swallowed them whole. Only one soul was left alive in the kitchen, a slave woman the Ledgers called Isabel Cordova. She sat at the table, humming a tune from a world they'd tried to erase, drawing the edge of a carving knife across a whetstone with slow, deliberate strokes. When the magistrate demanded to know what happened, she said 7 words in broken English. Coal is slow, but it burns complete. Colonial officials sealed every page, every drawing, every witness statement. For 2 centuries the file slept in a Charleston vault. Tonight, we are prying it open, not just to ask how it happened, but why a woman the law called property decided to turn a kitchen into a courtroom and the furnace into a verdict. Before we descend, hit subscribe and ring the bell. Stories like this don't survive unless somebody keeps the fire fed. And tell me where you're listening from. Does your town have a house no one stays in, a room that won't keep cool, a kitchen that always smells faintly of coal? Let's step backward, 15 years before the night the masters burned. Charleston, 1701. The harbour stank of pitch and sugar, ships groaning under barrel and bone. On a humid September dawn, a Portuguese brigantine slid in from Angola with 180 souls trapped beneath her deck. The men with silver buttons called them cargo. The priest with tired eyes called them baptismal candidates. One of those stolen was a young woman with salt-stiff hair and a gaze that did not bow. She had a name that didn't fit in any ledger, Isabel Cordova, daughter of a river chief who taught her to hunt bitter roots for fever and to read the water's secrets. In Charleston, the priest dipped her in a barrel and wrote a new name on a damp page, Isabel Cordova. La Sombra plantation lay north of the Ashley, 800 acres of rice and swamp and humming, bloodthirsty air. Its master, Don Mateo Aguelo, Don by vanity, not by birth, was an emigrant son of Cadiz who traded prayer for profit long before his ship left Spain. He wasn't the wealthiest planter, only the most careful. He counted calories for bodies he did not own and minutes for souls he did not think existed. The slave quarters called him El Contador, the counter. He liked numbers. He liked iron. He loved control. Isabella arrived at La Sombra with a split lip and an expression that scared the overseer without him knowing why. She learned their words and pretended not to. She learned their rules and walked inside them like a ghost. In the big house kitchen, she chopped, stirred, cleaned, and, most importantly, listened. Because La Sombra wasn't just a plantation. It was the private club for a circle of planters who called themselves the 14. Rice prices. Patrol routes. How many lashes break a man without breaking him for good? Which shipmaster looked the other way for a coin? They discussed it all within arm's reach of Isabella's knife and Isabella's memory. She never forgot a thing. They thought her quiet because the quiet they recognized is fear. The quiet they did not recognize is strategy. On Sundays she wove palmetto mats and threaded tiny knots into their edges, messages disguised as patterns. Patrol near River Bend. Trader changed route. Don Mateo drunk tonight. The people in the quarters learned to read her mats like scripture. Years slid by in the way years do when every day takes your name and uses another. The kitchen trained her hands. The ledgers trained her rage. At night, when the house went still, Isabella sat beside the coal furnace and listened. Wood whispers. Coal thinks. It waits. It stores the sun and gives it back slow. That's when she noticed how Don Mateo smiled when he showed the furnace to his guests. Imported firebrick from England, iron doors from a foundry in Bristol, draft vents that could turn a pot into a kiln. He bragged about temperature the way other men brag about horses. 2,000 degrees, he'd say, patting the iron like a pet. Enough to melt a man's ring. Then, laughing, he'd pass the rum. Isabella marked that smile with a pin in the map she kept in her head. The 14 came and went, each with his specialty in cruelty. Captain Thomas Bray, retired Navy, who ran his fields by a boatswain's whip. Judge Elijah Wayne, who could recite scripture without blinking while ordering a child sold. Phineas Crow, the inventor, who built a hinged iron teaching collar with bells to catch the sound of defiance. Names like Rot in the Rafters, each leaving a different stain. Sometime in the winter of 1714, the counter began a new arithmetic. He started a breeding program. He told guests it was husbandry, like cattle, and wrote small notes in the ledger. Isabella, good hips, place with prime male from Warwick. He said it over supper, like discussing weather. The fork trembled in Isabella's hand, but no one noticed because men never watch the hands that serve them. That night she went to the river to be alone and wasn't. A man was already there, washing the day from his arms. He was tall in the way trees are tall, rooted and quiet. The ledger named him Saul. The quarters named him Manso, not because he was tame, but because he could gentle a panicked heart with a look. He lifted his chin, a greeting not daring to be a greeting. "You know knots?" she asked, holding out a ragged mat with an edge of strange pattern. "I know them now," he said after a long look. "There are love stories that are loud and bright and quick. Theirs was not. It grew where nothing should." Between patrol songs and the hiss of the marsh, in the space after a plate was set and before a hand took it, he taught letters one charcoal line at a time in the smoke-black corner of a shed. She taught herbs with the same patience her father taught her, how willow loves a fever, how foxglove can slow a heart, how nightshade tells truth to a body if you ask it in the right tongue. They drew maps in the dirt with a stick and erased them with their feet. They learned which overseer's wife hated the smell of coal and opened windows that should stay shut. Small things. Small fires. Then came the spring of 1716. A ship from Havana. Rumors of Spanish buyers who would pay silver for seasoned stock. The 14 drank to new money and spoke of old problems. Runaways who vanished into the swamp, drums heard when no drums were allowed, a kitchen girl too quiet, a field hand who looked men in the eye. Don Matea's ledger grew new lines like mold. One afternoon, while the men argued rice prices through cigar smoke, Isabella stood in the doorway long enough to be invisible and heard the sentence that changed the room's temperature. "Isabella goes to the breeding house next month," Don Matea said, like moving a barrel. "Pair her with Warwick's Tom. Should get good yield." The laugh that followed was cheap and felt expensive. She did not blink. She did not breathe. She set down the empty tray and left the way steam leaves a room. At the river that night, Manso's hand shook when she told him. "We can run," he said. "Saint Augustine. A trader owes me. There is a priest who writes for the governor. He keeps a candle for people like us." She shook her head, slow as a funeral bell. "Running saves too," she said. "They will still be here. The furnace will still be here. Their meetings will still be here. And the girls not yet born will still be here." "What then?" he asked, voice low. She looked toward the big house, where a square of kitchen window glowed in the dark like a watching eye. "Cole," she said. "Cole thinks. We will teach it patience." 4 weeks, she was only careful. She changed nothing obvious. She changed everything small. She learned the damper's true language, how one quarter turned stole air, how another fed the belly until the brick sang. She learned how much coal the carts could carry before the wheel left a different groove that a suspicious eye might follow. She learned which herbs made sleep heavy but left no taste in brandy. She learned how long it took for drunk laughter to turn into open mouths and snoring men who believed they could not be touched. She learned, too, who would not speak if the world broke in front of them. Hannah in the scullery with the scar that smiled when she could not. Old Ben in the smokehouse who carried 3 lashes in one shoulder and 2 in the other and said, "Girl, there are days when God is late. You go ahead and keep time for him." On the morning the 14 were due to meet at La Sombra, The air itself felt like a wet cloth. The river hardly moved. The birds were quiet. Isabella lit the furnace before dawn, the way she always did, and no one thought twice about it because the kitchen always woke first. She hummed to it the lullaby her mother sang, for notes that held a whole river. "Coal is slow," she whispered to the bricks, "but it remembers." Beyond the kitchen, wheels crunched the shell drive. Boots thudded the porch. Voices filled the house. She carried trays, poured brandy, counted glasses, watched hands. Don Mateo told the same joke he always told. Captain Bray asked for extra salt. Judge Wayne asked for a bowl of ice for his swollen knuckles, and Isabella brought it, because sometimes justice is a patient servant. She glanced once at the furnace door. The iron glowed in a way only someone who loved it would notice. When the clock in the hall chimed 9, the dining room conversation shifted from price to punishment, from seed to blood. Isabella slid into the pantry and closed the door on her side of the world. She could hear them through the thin wall, their laughter like a knife rubbed on stone. She opened a small wax packet and let a pinch of something dark fall into a decanter's throat. She shook it gently, watching the swirl swallow itself, then set it on a silver tray with 12 crystal glasses that would make tiny bells when they touched each other. Her pulse did not change. The house breathed in. The furnace breathed out. On the other side of the pantry door, the men toasted a future in which no one could touch them. Isabella de Cordova exhaled, and began. The silver tray rang once, thin crystal notes drowned by laughter, and then the brandy did what brandy always did at La Sombra, loosened tongues and slow judgment. No one saw Isabella's eyes when she watched the room drink. That was by design. She kept her gaze on the table's edges and the candle drips, on the way flames shivered when a man lied. In the pantry, the furnace spoke through the wall, a slow, even roar, the breath of something caged too long. Isabella checked the damper with one careful, practiced turn. Enough air to keep the belly bright, not enough to roar a warning. She wiped her hands. She breathed. She counted. First to wobble was Phineas Crow, the iron inventor. His joke broke in the middle and he stared hard at his fork as if it had betrayed him. Captain Bray blamed the heat and tugged at his cravat. Judge Wayne reached for the bowl of ice he had requested and missed it by an inch. Don Mateo, the counter, narrowed his eyes at the brandy as if arithmetic could bully a drink into being safe. Isabella's face never changed. She carried new decanters, gathered empty ones, skimmed the room with a housekeeper's eye, who was slipping, who would fight when the world tilted, who drooled when he slept like a child. She let the quiet herbs do their slow, inevitable work. No drama. No poison's hot bite. Just gravity leaning a little harder on men who were already leaning. By the time the hall clock chimed 10, the table looked like a painting left out in the rain. Elbows slid. Chairs scraped. Laughter collapsed into a soft grunt as someone's face met his forearm. Don Mateo stood fast, he always did, but his stance widened and the candlelight found sweat at his temples. Isabella waited. She had learned patience from coal itself. Then the timing she had practiced in the silent hours unfolded like a map. Hannah passed in the hall with the laundry cart precisely when two bodies needed moving. Old Ben appeared with the smokehouse keys just when a door would have squealed. At the pantry threshold, Manso, the ledger's Warwick Tom, materialized like a shadow that had learned to walk. He said nothing. He didn't have to. They had rehearsed this moment with whispers and the language of hands. Together, they took the room apart. Rope coiled from a closet that always stayed locked, except tonight. Iron shackles from a chest that had always chained other people. Isabella's knots were neat, impersonal, the kind a ship uses to hold against storm. Cotton from the bale in the storage room became plugs that turned masters' mouths into the same silent white they had stuffed for export. She moved each man carefully, not out of mercy but out of discipline. This was a trial. Trials require order. They staggered the transfers so footsteps never stacked in the hall. Crow first, because he'd wake sudden and violent if left asleep too long. Then Bray, heavy and mean, whom Manso took by the shoulders and, with 3 smooth steps, lowered to the pantry floor. Judge Wayne, a surprise, light and frail under the robes of his certainty. Don Mateo last, because the counter deserved to understand where he was going even if he could no longer command his legs to refuse it. By 2 in the morning, 14 bodies lay in the kitchen, arranged like hours around a square iron clock. The furnace's glow turned their faces a color no candle could mimic. Outside, the marsh croaked a single note. Inside, the damper whispered when Isabella touched it. One last, tiny adjustment. The bricks thrummed. She stood, palms on the work table, and listened to everything at once. The soft drag of breath, the iron sigh, Manso's footfall leaving the back steps exactly when he'd promised he would. The house had never been so quiet. Quiet enough, finally, for a verdict. Dawn came mean and grey, the kind of light that shows corners men avoid. In that thin light, eyelids fluttered. Isabella watched attention return to faces like tide returning to a stranded fish. Bewilderment, then fear, then surging panic when wrists refused wrists and iron answered with an indifferent tug. They couldn't cry out. The raw cotton swelled at the first tongue's push, a small, final harvest silencing the mouths that had priced human life by the acre. Captain Bray tried to spit it out and gagged. Judge Wayne tried to pray, she saw it in his eyes, and found prayer has trouble breathing when it's gagged by the very commodity his court had justified. "Good morning, gentlemen," Isabella said. Her English was clearer than any had ever heard it. Words she'd hoarded for 15 years came out smooth and steady. "Breakfast is late. You forgive me." She circled them once the way they had circled boys and girls on auction blocks, assessing bone and teeth and compliance, listing strengths and defects. She let them see themselves in her eyes and see nothing there that they recognized. No pleading, no panic, only work. "Here is how we will do this," she said, folding her hands. "I will speak. You will listen. When it is time for silence, the furnace will talk for me. We will keep good order." A movement at her left. Don Mateo testing the rope like a man testing a gate, looking for the broken hinge. Isabella crouched. "Senor," she murmured in the tone she'd used for years, the one that kept her alive. "You always said I was your best in the kitchen. Believe me now. I know every door in this house." She held up his ledger. He jerked, a fish on dry plank. "I learned numbers from watching you," she said. "Let us count together." She read dates, flat, unemotional, each entry a small cut made in ink, not flesh. The ledger listed losses, gains, yields. It did not list names, only descriptions. Female, solid hips. Boy, strong wrists. Man, insolent. Isabella had written the names they belonged to on scraps of cloth in her memory years ago so the book could not erase them. As she spoke, she replaced the ledger's lies with what it had tried to bury. 2 lashes short of breaking point, she read, and then looked at Captain Bray. "You told that to Elijah Wayne when a 10-year-old fainted." He wrote it down next to the price of salt. She set the book aside and knelt so her face was level with theirs. "You ask why you are here," she said softly. "You are here because Cole thinks." She tapped the iron door. "It takes time we never had and keeps it. It made a place for me to put 15 years." Her palm rested flat against warm iron. "Now it gives time back slow." She moved the chairs, one shove each, closing the circle tighter, making sure no ankle could touch the door, no hand could grip a hinge. The men watched the distance shrink, inch by inch, the way a horizon disappears in fog. "Water," she said suddenly, as brightly as if she were speaking to guests at table. She fetched a tin cup, tipped it to each gagged mouth. Enough to keep them awake. Not enough to cool. She was not cruel. She was meticulous. Outside, first birds started. Inside, the furnace deepened in tone, a low, comfortable growl. Isabella adjusted the draft again. No drama, no flourish, and the iron brightened the way a face brightens when it understands a difficult truth. Retribution begins in the mind. Isabella knew this because hers had been a battlefield long before her hands found iron. She sat the ledger on the butcher's block and opened another book, not bound in leather, bound in memory, and read from that instead. "To you, Mr. Crow," she said conversationally, "I bring reminder. 2 winters ago you built a collar with bells for a woman who could not stop humming or she would break. You told your friends it was training. Today I will hum for you, and you cannot make it stop." She hummed her mother's 4-note song. The kitchen changed when she did. The sound made the iron sound older. Judge Wayne made a choking noise, and for a moment Isabella saw not a judge but a boy who'd learned to be important by being cruel. She didn't mistake that for innocence. If cruelty is a skill, it's still a choice. "Captain Bray," she went on, "there was a man named Thomas who asked to see the river one last time. You said he could see it from the cage. 3 days he watched water he could not touch." She didn't raise her voice. The low tone forced men to lean, to pay attention, to join her in the ritual they never expected to attend. She did not name every sin. That would take a lifetime, and she was done giving them lifetimes. She picked the ones that built their power like bricks and pulled those bricks, one by one, describing each as she put it on the table. With every story, the kitchen shed temperature that had nothing to do with heat, an illusion cluing them that the thing they called order had been held up by the quiet hands of people they'd refused to see. She wasn't alone. Hannah appeared in the doorway once, already crying for a grief she'd been clenching for years. Isabella shook her head slightly. Not yet. Old Ben's shadow crossed the threshold and paused. He nodded once to the furnace, the way a man might nod to a grave. Then he was gone. Their absence later would be important. Silence is a skill too. At mid-morning, when the iron's light had settled into that steely, hypnotic orange, Isabella set the ledger aside for good. "We will change the language now," she said. "You called this room the kitchen. Today it is the court. You called what you did discipline. Today we call it by its name." She untied one cotton plug long enough for Don Mateo to try words. He used them for bargaining. Of course he did. He offered money, passage, papers, a priest's letter. Isabella listened as if to a recipe that always curdled. Then she replaced the cotton, gently, and smoothed his hair back like a mother might. For a breathlong moment, sorrow came across her face like a cloud. Not for him. For the world that made this necessary. "Now," she whispered to the furnace, "you speak." She did not touch hot iron to flesh. She did not need to. The furnace could do its work without theater. Isabella closed the last damper a quarter turn, and the air in the room shifted, subtle, like the moment when a storm decides to stay. Heat is not always a sensation. Sometimes it's a presence that sits with you, that inhabits your breath. The men learned heat that way. The iron did not roar. It thrummed like a drum heard through a wall. Their faces took on a sheen that had nothing to do with effort. Throats worked under cloth. Eyes watered, then dried. Sweat came and could not cool because the air had decided to hold on to everything. Isabella moved among them with the cup. "Stay," she whispered when her head lolled. "You must witness." The furnace agreed in its low language. She wetted cloths, touched them to foreheads, traced lines on cheeks as if applying blessing. It looked like mercy. It was methodology. Death, quick, was easy. What had not been allowed to the people they had broken would not be offered here. Not because she wanted their suffering, because she wanted their comprehension. The circle tightened again, almost imperceptibly, chair legs squeaking toward iron. She had measured the tiles earlier. She knew exactly how far men would feel heat as something they could not ignore, and how close they could be before instinct took thought from them. She kept them on the edge where thought still lived. As bodies began to shake and breath shortened, she spoke into the air what no ledger could contain. She told a story about a village far from this river where old women taught girls how to listen to roots, and young men learned to read the current by its foam. She spoke their words aloud in a language none of the men knew and watched those words change the room. The kitchen, which had always been their mouth, became her mouth. "Cole," she said, almost to herself, almost to her mother. "You kept the sun while we worked in rain. Give it back now." Time loosened into something wider. In that wide time, Isabella saw every room where decisions had been made. The courtroom where Judge Wayne set prices for orphan children, the counting house where Phineas Crow filed receipts for chains, the parlor where wives averted their eyes, the church pew where prayers were said for a prosperity that tasted like salt and blood. She did not forgive those rooms. She simply refused to let them be the last story. One by one, the men stopped struggling. Not because the ropes relaxed. Because they understood the arithmetic. They would not rise from these chairs. Isabella held each gaze until understanding arrived. Some begged with eyes, old habits clinging to the last. Some went inward where boys go when fear takes their language. She saw each of them, not to save, but to confirm. Witness is a kind of power that no court can erase once it's made. Outside, the light rose and then began to fall. The kitchen dimmed, but the iron did not. It glowed like a square sun set too close, steady as a heartbeat. In the heat's slow tide, Isabella's mind slid backward to a bank of red earth and river reeds and her father's hand around her wrist. He was teaching her how to wait for fish without bait. "You are not tricking the river," he'd said. "You are learning what it already wanted to do." La Sombra had taught her the same lesson in another tongue. Systems only look strong from far away. Up close, they depend on 100 small obediences. She had tugged those threads for months, moving the smokehouse salt 2 steps to the left so a distracted overseer spent 10 minutes each morning looking for it, leaving a pantry door slightly ajar so a draft learned a new habit, teaching Hannah to tie knots that looked weak and weren't. The big act had arrived slow, arrived as 1,000 small acts braided into one. She had also learned the limits of rage. Fury burns hot and fast. It doesn't last a night, let alone a plan that must unfurl across seasons. Cole taught her a better anger, the kind that stores, that waits, that survives storms to give its heat when the night is the longest. That was why she had refused Manso's plea to run. Because the world she would leave behind would still be here. Because the girls who looked at her with eyes too old would still be called good hips. In the doorway now, Hannah stood again, face set, tears dry. Isabella nodded once. Hannah crossed to the table and lifted the ledger without being told. She didn't open it. She carried it to the furnace and held it for a breath to feel the heat's thought. Then she set it down, not inside, not yet. They were not hiding evidence. They were controlling the story. Old Ben returned with a canvas sack. He laid it on the floor and stepped back. Isabella opened it and took out plain things that would mean different things by dawn. 2 kitchen knives with their edges honed to bright whispers, a coil of wire, a small clay jar of salve that soothed burns she would, cruelly, not apply tonight. She wasn't here to brand. She was here to reverse a sentence. Manso did not return to the kitchen. That was the design. He was a shadow now, moving the way water moves when it finds a stone. He unlatched gates they wanted latched and latched ones they wanted open. He hung a lantern in a copse 3 fields away so any patrol would chase light where none belonged. He stood in the sugar grove where sound carries and listened. If there were hoofbeats, he would take them away, a decoy with calm breath and impossible feet. In the quarters, a rule held: no one spoke. Stories die when they try to grow too big in one night. The people who would need to say later they did not know anything must have the truth to say. They cooked. They were tired. They slept. That was their alibi and their survival. The court would need them safe. Isabella knew this. Justice never comes from the hands of one person. It comes from a net with 1,000 knots. She had tied hers over 15 years. Tonight, it held. The iron's language shifted again around afternoon. the pitch dropping to something that lived in bone rather than skin. Even without touching the door, Isabella felt it. The threshold between hurt and warning had been crossed. This was the place where her plan risked turning from justice to spectacle. She refused that. She had chosen slowness not to amplify pain but to guarantee understanding. She stepped back from the circle and spoke to the room as if announcing the last dish of a long supper. "Gentlemen," she said, "listen with the ears you use for harvest. It is near." The cotton muffled sound, but not all sound. Moans are not words, and so they escape rules meant for talk. She let them. Let each man hear the other as background, proof that this wasn't a private tragedy but a shared ending. Then, clean as a blade through paper, hoofbeats. Manso's signal, 3 taps on the kitchen sill, soft as moth wings, touched the air. Isabella's chin lifted. She didn't move. The hoofbeats passed where the decoy lantern burned and faded toward the river. Patrols could be taught, too. If you give them a false story often enough, they'll look for it when they're scared. After, the silence deepened like a lung taking a long breath. Shadows lengthened across the iron face and shivered when the draft voiced its hunger. She gave it another finger-width of air. That was all. When she turned back, her gaze landed on Don Mateo. For the first time that day, he wasn't watching the door. He was watching her. In that look, she saw calculation gone thin and something else threading through it. Respect's faint ghost, the kind a general might give an enemy who knows the map better. It didn't save him. It did, briefly, warm a part of her she thought Cole had taken. She knelt again and removed his gag one last time. This time he did not bargain. He asked a question. "Why you?" It was not, "Why me?" He still couldn't imagine a world in which he wasn't centered. "Because I was here," she said. "Because I heard your numbers and knew where to put them." She replaced the cotton, and he did not resist. Sun touched the kitchen window, a last yellow mark before the panes went black. The men were almost quiet now. The sounds that remained were small, stubborn human things. A breath that catches because water longs for air, the involuntary hum the body makes when it is afraid of the dark. Isabella hummed back. 4 notes. The iron held them and made them ring. The night finished the jury's work. By the time stars winked on over the river, the circle had learned everything it was going to learn. Isabella stood a long while, hand on the iron door, not to open or close, but to feel. The heat that had been so present all day gathered itself the way a storyteller does at the end. Content, but not yet gone. She offered a last cup to each man who remained conscious. 2 mouths refused. She did not force. Choice was something she could give even now. Then the room changed. Not a sound. Instead a pressure lifting. Pain leaving does that, takes weight with it. Isabella felt it like a breeze through a house sealed too long. She did not smile. She did not cry. She let the change pass through her like weather. When it was over, she arranged the bodies exactly as she had planned. A perfect circle around the square furnace, wrists still bound, mouth still stuffed, boots aligned by an eye that could see straight even when the world's lines tried to bend. She opened 2 windows because she wanted the dawn to see and not accuse the kitchen of only hiding things. She washed her hands. She reset the table with the same precision she had used that afternoon. Saturday. She drew the knife down the whetstone in slow, even passes, not to threaten, but because work makes waiting bearable. Then she began to hum. They found her like that. Overseers first, faces bloodless, bravado leaking out in whispers. Then a magistrate, summoned before sunup. He took in the circle, the iron glow, the knives, the calm woman with ash on her forearms, and his mouth did a soft, useless fish thing. "What happened here?" he asked because that's what he knew how to ask. Isabella looked up with the mildness she had practiced for half a life. "Justice," she said, and then gave him the line that would be carved into rumor like an epitaph. "Coal is slow, but it burns complete." He blanched. He gestured. He quoted laws, old ones, new ones not yet written. In the space between his words, other people did what people always do when power trips. They swept, they covered, they tried to smallen a thing that had outgrown their arms. But the room would not be smalled. Some rooms remember. Power doesn't walk. It scurries behind closed doors. Within hours, the governor's men were in Don Matea's study, pulling down ledgers, cursing at numbers that refused to change their meaning. The 14's wives arrived wrapped in shawls and denial. A priest crossed himself 3 times and looked everywhere but the circle. In the courtyard, a murmur gathered, not quite a crowd, not quite dispersal, a sound like a question trying to decide if it was safe to be asked. The governor's council met that afternoon in a room that smelled of damp wool and fear. They did the arithmetic the counter would have done. 14 dead men who had paid for elections, for patrols, for pews. 1 living woman who had overturned a table they all ate at. If the story spread, every supper club in the colony would find its seats suddenly uncomfortable. So they did what frightened councils do. They sealed. They stamped. They locked. They rewrote. The official narrative became a house fire and unfortunate smoke inhalation. Papers went into a vault beneath Charleston stone. The word Isabella vanished from the public mouth. She didn't. She sat in a cell for 3 nights while men argued over the shape of her end. Hanging would be a spectacle they did not dare. Burning would be too on the nose. A whipping might kill her too slowly for their schedules. In the end, they selected a sentence that let them believe they had washed their hands. Sail to a Spanish factor bound for Cartagena and the mountain mines. She will die, one counselor said, relieved by the distance. But not here. On the dock, the day they loaded her, the sky wore iron. Seagulls shouted over a ship named Santa Isabella. Shackles clicked. Sailcloth snapped. A clerk wrote with speedy strokes, trying not to think about what he was writing. Isabella looked up the harbor water to the line where it becomes ocean and said nothing. But someone said something to her. 3 sailors who spoke a Portuguese that had been to Angola and back. One of them touched the brim of his hat the way a man touches a memory he would like to keep. The ship eased into the harbor mouth. Thunder rolled far off. The ledger recorded what came next as fever, buried at sea. But ledgers have lied before. What did not go into the vault were the sounds the story made once the kitchen emptied. They started in the quarters at La Sombra, a hush that was not fear, then a hum that was not song. From there, they travelled in baskets with fish and skeins of yarn and bolts of cloth for barter, in the mouths of women who sold cakes at the dock, in the steps of men hired to haul salt. The words never said coal furnace. They said kitchen. They never said 14 planters. They said the circle. Across the river, a sugar house burned clean through the night. In the morning, its owner swore it was a lightning strike, though the sky had been clear. In Warwick, a breeding ledger went missing and turned up 6 months later in a church on its altar, open to a page no one could bear to read. In Kingsley's Fields, there was a week in August when the cane knives all went dull in a single day, a small, perfect catastrophe the overseer wrote down as devilry because he had no other word for discipline in reverse. Most of these were not acts that broke bones. They were acts that broke confidence. Masters began carrying pistols to breakfast. Patrols stopped walking single paths and started stumbling through new ones, getting lost. Meetings of planters grew shorter and their drinks weaker. Wives sat upright in bed at the same hour every night and could not say why. And in the kitchens, the serious rooms, new habits took root. Women kept bottles of water in cool places and not for cooking. Men made sure doors that should be open were open and those that should be closed were closed, and stood in front of any hand that tried to do differently. Someone always knew where the matches were. Someone always knew where the matches were not. An intelligence map drew itself in tiny lines only visible if you stood very far away or very close. Both views showed the same shape, not a fire, but embers, spread wide, kept safe, patient. Years don't pass in a straight line. They bend around stories. La Sombra's kitchen became a bend. Rumor said Isabella never reached Cartagena. Some swore she died and rose on a Havana dock in the mouth of a thunderhead and walked away wearing another woman's shawl. Others said she boarded the Santa Isabella twice and left it twice before noon on different coasts, because stories make saints when they need them. A Spanish clerk's private journal, written in a crabbed hand, recorded a conversation with a mulatta woman with eyes like iron, who spoke Portuguese bad enough to be honest and English too good to be safe. She asked for paper. He gave her the torn flyleaf of an old missal. She wrote a list of names he could not read and folded it into the lining of her dress. What can be measured is this: planters counted costs differently after 1716. They stopped hosting big meetings in kitchens. They learned to look at ovens as if ovens might look back. Some tightened their rule into something that squeaked when it moved. Others, fewer, loosened enough to be called good masters in a language that had no word for such a thing. Neither approach restored sleep. In 1739, drums sounded by the Stono River. Men marched south, killing, then being killed. The official accounts don't mention kitchens. The unofficial ones say a woman walked ahead of the first group for a mile and then stepped aside as if she had only ever been pointing a direction. La Sombra changed hands 3 times in 20 years. The kitchen never stayed staffed. New cooks heard singing when no one was there and left knives on the table just so they could walk out with empty hands. Eventually, the owners sealed the door and built a smaller kitchen in an outbuilding like you build a new room when a house has decided one of its rooms belongs to someone else. Half a century later, when the vault finally opened, the docket clerk expected brittle paper and a boring afternoon. He found, instead, that the file was thinner than it should have been and thicker than it had any right to be. Missing: witness statements from 2 overseers who died poor but never left the county, a sketch of the kitchen done by a young deputy with talent and nightmares, a letter from the priest who would not sleep through thunder anymore. Present: a recipe list with brandy underlined twice, a page from Don Matea's ledger with one line drawn through a price and the word no written over it in a woman's hand, a single cotton bowl in a wax paper envelope that had held its shape through decades of heat and damp. The clerk made notes with a thin pen and licked his finger to turn pages as if the book might bite. When he went home that night, his wife asked why his sleeves smelled faintly of smoke. He had no answer. La Sombra's kitchen was rubble by then, the iron stripped for war, the bricks repurposed into a fence someone swore was wrong because the ivy never took to it. Children dared each other to run the old kitchen foundation at dusk and then lied about how far they'd gone. On some nights, with the wind low and the frogs too tired to sing, the damp air hummed 4 notes so faint you could pretend you'd imagine them. Some people hear ghosts. Others hear instructions. And that is where we leave Isabella de Cordova, not as a ghost, not as a saint, but as a woman who learned the river of a system and then, with patience as her oar, rode it the other way for one long, deliberate night. 14 seats that had held power became 14 witnesses to their own end. A square of iron that had been pried became a mouth that told the truth they could not speak. 3 centuries later, kitchens still remember. They remember who did the counting and who did the cooking. They remember what was said over brandy and what was planned over boiling pots. They remember that coal is slow, and some kinds of justice must be too. What do you think happened on that harbor? Did Isabella walk away beneath a thunderhead? Or did the sea keep her secret and let the story do the walking for her? Do you believe the missing pages were stolen by cowards? Or protected by the brave? Are there still ledgers bricked into walls, recipes that aren't recipes at all, cellars that hum because a furnace somewhere else is still thinking? Tell me what you believe. Drop your thoughts below, and tell me where you're listening from. I want to know the state, the town, the haunted kitchen you've never liked walking past. If this tale held you, if Isabella's 4 notes linger in your head, make sure you're subscribed to Tales Never Told and tap that bell so you never miss when we pry open another sealed file. Share this story with someone who thinks history only lives in books. Sometimes it lives in rooms. Sometimes it lives in the things that get hot slow and cool slower. We keep these voices burning by telling them out loud. Together. See you in the next one.